The historical background to the establishment of the Norwegian Constitution in 1814 begins in the Napoleonic period in Northern Europe, with Norway being a part of the dual monarchy of Norway and Denmark, Copenhagen the capital, Frederick VI, King of Norway and Denmark, and Napoleon essentially creating all sorts of havoc in Europe, and the great powers opposing him. And it all closes in on Norway because one of the allies of the great powers is Karl Johan, the King of Sweden. Karl Johan fashions a foreign policy that really picks up on Sweden's long-held plans to incorporate Norway into Sweden itself. By joining the alliance with the great powers, he moves his troops to the Danish border and threatens to attack Denmark, and with that threat, the Danish king is willing to negotiate. The negotiations go well for Sweden. In January 1814, Norway is transferred to Sweden, a price that the Danes had to pay to keep Sweden from attacking and occupying Denmark itself. So they amputated an arm to save the body. In Norway, however, there has been long a growing sense of sort of national feeling that led to a desire for the establishment of a separate national bank, a separate university, which was established the year earlier in 1813. And there they had no desire to join in union with Sweden. So the Crown Prince of Denmark, who happened to be the Governor General of Norway, devised a plan that he would reject the Treaty of Kiel and lead an independence movement of Norwegians. And he gathered together a group of notables meeting in Eidsvoll in February, on the 16th of February 1814, and there they talked about how they could prevent this transfer to Sweden. The Crown Prince, Christian Frederick, insisted that he would lead this resistance, and he did it because he felt that Norway was his right by inheritance, and that his cousin, the Danish king, had given away Sweden and destroyed that inheritance, which was his by right. However, members of this notable group that was meeting with him informed him that actually, by virtue of this transfer to Sweden, the King of Denmark had violated the treaty that went back to the establishment of the dual monarchy back in 1665. And instead of the power of authority in Norway, instead of devolving to either the King of Sweden or to the Crown Prince who wanted to claim his inheritance, it went back to the Norwegian people, who had initially given up their authority to the king to establish the dual monarchy and the absolute monarchy. Christian Frederick finally accepted that and said, it doesn't matter how I lead this independence movement and how I become king, as long as I become king. And he accepted that. He traveled around Norway, went to Trondheim. He met adoring crowds, and by March decided to send a representative, a diplomat, Christian Anker, to London to try to get England's acceptance of this independence move by Norway. A great debate took place in London, in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. And the Norwegian cause essentially was defeated in London, and Britain maintained a position in support of the transfer, rejecting Norway's independence because the British believed, with some reasonable truth to the matter, that the independence move had as a ultimate goal to reunite Norway with Denmark. While they were hoping for this support from England, Christian Frederick sent out a proclamation calling for all of the Norwegians to meet and elect representatives to a constituent assembly for the purpose of writing a constitution for independent Norway. The elections in those days, the way they had it, was that they took place in churches. So people went to their church, and then they chose delegates that would go to this assembly, which was to meet in April at Eidsvoll, which is where the Crown Prince was residing at the time. So elections are held, and on Easter Sunday in 1814, all of the delegates from around the country meet at Eidsvoll, with the exception of those from the north of Norway, the Finnmark and Troms. In fact, they weren't able to make it. They didn't make it to Eidsvoll until June, July, so well after everything had been finished. But this assembly then meets beginning on Easter Sunday in 1814, and for 6 weeks they debate a constitution for the country. The leading representatives of this constitution, constitutional assembly, come with all kinds of other constitutions, the American Constitution, the French Constitution of 1791, and some state constitutions from the American states, the Virginia Constitution, for example. So they have all these models, and then they fashion their own constitution, which is then completed on the 17th of May and signed formally. And then on that day, they also elect Christian Frederick to be king. He had served as regent sort of until then, and he's now elected king officially. And at that point, Sweden is still pressing, and England is not going to support the Norwegian cause. And as it develops, Swedish forces gather at the border, and in late July, the end of July 1814, there's a conflict between Norwegian and Swedish troops, a kind of a mini war. Historians have traditionally called it a demonstration. And it lasts for a couple of weeks. Christian Frederick, recognizing that Norway is no match against very trained, disciplined Swedish troops who had been fighting Napoleon for several years, who were far superior to the sort of ragtag Norwegian soldiers. And he finally agreed to a meeting that would result in a treaty ending the conflict at Moss, the Convention of Moss, August the 14th, 1814, in which he agreed to give up the throne and go back to Denmark. And Norway would then call a Storting, a parliamentary meeting. Parliament had been established under the Constitution, and in the agreement at Moss, the Swedish negotiators, Karl Johan primarily, agreed that Norway could keep its constitution, and the structure, the legislative and judicial structure that the Constitution established. he felt that it was best to get this resolved as quickly as possible, that his background as a revolutionary, he was a French general and marshal for Napoleon. He had grown up in France and was a member of the sort of revolutionary army under Napoleon. He had a reputation as a good soldier, but he was also had a reputation as a revolutionary. And the monarchs in Europe, who were part of this grand coalition with Britain and Austria and Germany and Russia, had Karl Johan as an ally simply because they needed that extra force against Napoleon. But now that Napoleon was gone, he had abdicated in April and was being sent to Elba that spring and summer. But would they support this former revolutionary to be king of Norway and Sweden? He didn't want to challenge it, and he wanted things in Norway to be quiet. The Norwegians had sort of been indicating they might fight a kind of a guerrilla war, a model that they had taken from Spain in the opposition to Napoleon. And that he didn't want, because that would continue this unrest in the north. He wanted everything quiet by then. So he allowed the Norwegians to keep their constitution, which really meant a great deal to them. But what they had to do was they had to agree to join union with Sweden. The Norwegian Parliament, the Storting, meeting in October, negotiated the terms, and they changed a few words in the Constitution that allowed for the main part of the Constitution to remain intact, but also allowed for the union and the Swedish king to be king of Norway. So the first paragraph in the Constitution essentially says Norway's an independent country united with Sweden. So they would add little phrases like that. The 17th of May, the day that they signed the Constitution and elected Christian Frederick as king, was not necessarily a moment to remember in 1814. It becomes that in the next year, in 1815, when a group of Norwegians in Trondheim have a big dinner celebration commemorating the signing of the Constitution the year earlier. And then that's the first sort of 17th of May celebration. The Swedes and Karl Johan wanted November 4th to be the national day for Sweden and for Norway, because that's the day the union sort of was finally agreed to. But Norwegians rejected the November 4th. They ignored that date, and they began to commemorate the Constitution of the 17th of May. And then in 1827, Henrik Wergeland, the son of Nikolai Wergeland, one of the signers of the Constitution, who became a sort of famous national romantic poet, was extremely active in sort of the protest movements against Sweden in the 1820s. And really through his agitation, the 17th of May becomes increasingly a day to commemorate not just the sort of Constitution, but the whole idea of Norwegian independence, even though that independence was in union with Sweden, which lasted for 91 years.